Hi, I'm Frostellian, and welcome to the RNG festival that is the Legion Destruction Warlock. This has turned into another long video, so in the interest of time I'm going to work on the assumption that you already are familiar with destruction from warlords. In Legion there is a 1.5 second global, reduced by haste, as are the base cast times. The single target core abilities are still there. Chaos Bolt, 3 second cast, deals large chaos damage, always crits, and crit rating increases damage. Immolate, 1.5 second cast, burns the enemy causing fire damage immediately and over 15 seconds. Incinerate, 2 second cast, draws fire towards the enemy dealing fire damage, and Conflagrate, instant 12 second cooldown reduced by haste, triggers an explosion on the target dealing fire damage. This doesn't appear to snare anymore, which will probably disappoint some PvPers. Life Tap, giving 30% max mana for 10% max health. You probably noticed I didn't mention their resource values. This is something that has been changed for Legion and is one of the issues facing the new spec. The priorities are basically identical to Warlords, so I feel comfortable enough that nobody's going to be lost whilst I spend a few minutes on resources to give you a clearer picture. Locks are now uniformly using soul shards and mana. Embers have been removed. Whilst you had 5 embers and you now have 5 shards, the difference is the loss of the decimal place. Embers were made up of 10 bits, but there is only the one shard. So whilst they could have gone for fixed resource generation, it would arguably have made the rotation very inflexible, given there are only 5 combo points and 1 spender. So they've gone with procs, like Affliction. Before anybody panics, it's possible with any RNG that they can make the average quantity of shards generated over time the same as when it was actively generated. But RNG falters over specifics and planning, and the short-term variance in damage is more frustrating than enjoyable. They've attached primary shard generation onto Immolate. It has a 15% chance to generate 1 shard per tick, double to 30% on critical hits. And you can generate shards off the initial impact damage. Conflagrate also generates 1 shard, making it the only controllable source of shards, but at roughly every 10 seconds after haste, it's on a relatively long cooldown. Incinerate generates nothing. It is completely removed from shard mechanics, and is now the very definition of filler, serving only to keep you busy while you wait for shards. I never like seeing regularly used abilities outside of resource mechanics, but there is a benefit to having your primary generator as a passive dot. You can cast the spender whilst generating shards, but with proc rates being as they are, it only really becomes viable with multiple immolates, and that's where the benefit weakens, because without Cataclysm you have to hardcast Immolate. Not only have they changed the method of generation, they've also changed the cost of Chaos Bolt. It is now 2 shards. Wowhead says the coefficient is 500% spell power in Legion and 227% in Warlords. I can work the damage backwards in Warlords for my character and get a coefficient of 226.9%. But when I do the same for Legion, I only get 349.9%. WowDB has it as 360% with a 500% baseline, so it's possible it's inconsistent, or my maths is just really bad, which is always an option. But worrying about tuning at this point isn't something I do, but a coefficient less than double Warlords is a reduction in damage for the same cost. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that the damage per shard has been maintained. So in that respect, dealing twice the damage for the same cast is a good thing. But ignoring all of this, in gameplay I find this higher cost more of a problem than passive generation. With a total range of 5 shards, we can only store 2 Chaos Bolts. Yes, it's the equivalent of 4, and yes, you can now effectively cast those in half the time, but because you don't control your own resources, you don't want to hit 5 shards, as you could be overwriting new shards. So once you hit 4, you need to cast 1 Chaos Bolt, or half of your total available Chaos Bolts. This means pooling for important burn phases becomes incredibly awkward. Because you have to build up shards through RNG over time beforehand, you only have 2 choices for bleeding the excess during preparation, and both have flaws. Either accurately maintain shards by spending them every time they hit 4, putting you between 2 and 4 shards, which means you risk not having 2 bolts ready to go for the phase, or the other option, hit 5 shards early, sit in the 3 to 5 range, and have 2, possibly even 3 Chaos Bolts ready, but risk overcapping shards in the interim, lowering your pre-phase DPS. In both of these situations, I'm accounting for 1 shard from Conflagrate and no procs as the phase starts, because you can't count on RNG to save you from bad planning. A less confusing way of putting this is you either maintain DPS during preparation and potentially lose it in the burn phase, or potentially lose DPS during preparation to guarantee it in the burn phase. Ultimately, it's going to depend on how important the phase is and your passive generation rate to determine which part you sacrifice, but you are being taxed either way. And with such a narrow range, you are constrained by inefficiencies at both ends. During sustained single target, you are waiting for RNG to give you shards, and during AoE with high shard generation, you are unable to spend them as fast as you generate them. So you swing wildly from famine to feast and have little room to control either end of it. However, the range can't be that large, otherwise the resources become meaningless, but you get the same effect when the range is too narrow. Now, I fully appreciate that I'm playing this with crit rates lower than expected for raid gear, but shard generation really is too slow single target. It's only decent enough to play the single target rotation with several immolates rolling. It's probable that you will grow into it with higher crit, but in the weeks for that gap to close, you will likely find many players thinking they made a bad decision choosing destruction as their first weapon. Okay, that pretty much covers what I wanted to talk about with resources. So with all that in mind, let's finish going through the rest of the core stuff. The single target priorities should be familiar. Keep immolate up, use conflag charges, chaos spots if you have 2 or more shards, incinerate when nothing else to do, and life tap when you run out of mana. As the shards come in, spend them on chaos bolt. That's it. There is nothing of any complexity in the core setup. The only thing that can provide you with any optimizations are conflag charges, because you can place a shard anywhere in the recharge window. This is basically the only thing you have to demonstrate ability. But if you don't care about such things, and as long as you use shards early, you can just macro conflag onto incinerate, then remove it from your bars and never know the difference, which even holds true when fully talented. Moving on, one of the great strengths of destruction is Havoc, which has received a buff. No longer is it capped at 1 Chaos Bolt or 3 normal spells, you have completely free reign for its entire 8-second duration, and you can cast as many Chaos Bolts as you physically can, which is 3 without procs. Havoc is triggered from the start of the cast, not the end, so you only need to have 0.1 of a second left on the buff when you start casting to cleave the spell. Whilst Immolate takes from Havoc proc shards, I don't know if the impact does, because whilst conflag damage is mirrored, it only generates the 1 shard. And now we arrive at AoE. Unfortunately, Rain of Fire has resurfaced. It has a 2-second cast and costs 3 shards. It is a placed spell that lasts 8 seconds. The cast time and the duration are reduced by haste. I am unable to get good results of this ability because it's amazingly bugged, the most serious being that it stops dealing damage when you cast another Rain of Fire. Those lost ticks are then added to or completely forgotten by the next set of ticks, where the total number are never the same and are only vaguely around what should be the combined total. In isolation, the duration from cast to final tick is 8 seconds without haste, and it ticks every second from cast. The value of each tick is variable, meaning it is affected by mastery, with the base value simply being the total divided by 8. This might seem obvious, but the first few times I tried it on the target dummy to see how it worked between builds, it consistently lost ticks and gave me lower damage than the tooltip. I only resolved the issue when it finally gave me a tick with a 0 roll on mastery so I could see the average, and then it miraculously found all 8 ticks after that. Believe it or not, this is still progress on the previous build, where it only gave 5 ticks randomly throughout the duration, which leads me to conclude it is not uniformly hitting all targets within its boundary. Every tick in the combat log is listed as being individually cast, which I assume is down to it being ground-based because ticks can't be attached to things that move out of range. Additional casts are being listed as refreshed, even if placed nowhere near the first location, but it's not affected by dot extension mechanics, which could have been a possibility since it's refreshing, but I wouldn't expect it to be because that doesn't make any sense. After a while though, I just stopped caring because Rain of Fire has always been disappointing, so I started thinking more in terms of its intended function. Assuming they make Rain work, and that it stacks multiple times, it's not hard to use. You get 3 shards and drop it over the things. If you want to cast 2, so that you can have 1 precast and 1 on spawn, the best you can do is get 5 shards, Rain, conflag, Rain. That's it. But there are a few problems just with this. As the primary source of AoE, it's a longish dot, about 7 seconds factoring in haste. That isn't good, for several reasons. First, ads die very quickly. A lot of the duration is going to be lost. Therefore, why am I wasting 3 shards to only deliver a fraction of the damage. You could argue that because it's a dot you can multicast it, or that it frees up time to use other forms of direct AoE. But outside of the new Fire and Brimstone and Cataclysm, there is no other AoE. This is basically it. Second, it's very expensive. Rain costs 3 shards, 60% of your total resources, and 50% more than Shard Remains, Chaos Bolt and Warlords, not forgetting to factor in the time it takes RNG to generate 3 shard single target. For that price, the area should immediately and violently explode for massive damage, not be dribbled on gradually to vague effect. I don't have a problem with higher resource costs for AoE in general if the damage it delivers is quick enough. You could argue the higher cost is there to make use of higher shard generation, if you somehow managed to multi-target immolate before everything died, Cataclysm notwithstanding. But the worst part is there are no other AoE shard spenders. Shard Remains has been removed, and with it too, the AoE Chaos Bolts. Now, for me aesthetically, I much prefer watching mini Chaos Bolts weave across the room and land with visceral effect. But perhaps designers worried that AoE Chaos Bolts would make it all Chaos Bolts all the time, like it is now, in which case change Rain of Fire into something more akin to Meteor. Really, I'm not so bothered about the method, but the manner in which the damage is delivered. Whilst we're talking about Rain, it has a weapon trait that was recently changed, Lord of Flames. Once every 10 minutes, summon 6 Infernals for 8 seconds. Well, true to Rain of Fire, these currently don't work. They spawn but run back to you and then wait to die. Is this better than the old, nerfed, token lone Infernal? No, it isn't. Why is there a 10-minute cooldown attached to another ability? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. No idea what the final damage will be, but if it does become more than just a gimmick, as it's a 10-minute cooldown, is there now an expectation to cast Rain with the first 3 shards on open single target? Whilst that might be a bit of a stretch, they spawn the first time Rain is cast, and usually the first wave of adds gets utterly annihilated by combined cooldowns. The only perk of a once per fight cooldown is that you decide when you use it. Well, that took longer than expected, but whilst I'm dealing with irritating mechanics, let's look at the mastery, Chaotic Energies. Your spells deal a random amount of additional damage, and damage you take is also reduced by a random amount. So this is just versatility, the stat universally loved by the player base, but now with added RNG. The randomness means I have to rely on tooltips or fan sites to get the spell coefficients to check how damaging abilities are working. And for things like Rain of Fire that don't work at all, it means it's too much effort to even bother trying to see where it's broken. If they could add the mastery calculation on top, but attached by label, that breakdown would make checking things much easier, but has the long-term effect because it also means that logging raids and checking for recruits, you'll be able to see in different situations if player A just got really lucky with their mastery rolls compared to player B, or if they're actually doing something significant. Whilst you might be worried this would grossly inflate the combat log, Destruction only has 5 spells, the majority of which are direct damage. Okay, let's finish looking at the rest of the core abilities. As far as cooldowns go, the Doomguard and Infernal are still there, but they now cost a shard to summon, are on a 3-minute cooldown instead of 10, and last 25 seconds. Disappointingly, Dark Soul has been removed, which is a real hit to shard generation as well as damage, so I have to assume that the Doomguard or Infernal are intended to take its place as Burst. However, it's possible to have them as permanent pets, which means you could have no innate cooldowns at all. The ability from the artifact weapon is Dimensional Rift. 1.5 second cast, 45 second cooldown, 3 charges. Rips a hole in time and space, opening a portal that damages your target. There are 3 different types of Rift that are picked randomly. Unstable Tear is a Chaos Barrage that deals many ticks. Shadow Tear deals Shadow Bolts, 7 shots that have 4 times the damage of a Barrage tick. And Chaos Tear fires a single Chaos Bolt and has very poor damage. All of these deliver flat damage, which means they are not affected by mastery, but they can crit. The damage comparison has Shadowy Tear with the most, then Unstable Tear slightly behind, and Chaos Tear being around 30% of the damage of the other 2. The utility and defensive toolset has been reduced, with several abilities moving into talents. Drain Life has changed its healing from spell power to a percentage of max health that increases with gear, but the damage is low, so you really don't want to be using this if you can help it. Soul Leech is a passive where all single target damage done by you and your pets grants absorb shields worth 15% of max health for 15 seconds. Most of the abilities are still there, Fear, Banish, Gateway, Unending Resolve, Summoning, and Soul and Health Stones, and some other minor things, but Soul Shatter appears to have been removed. And there is one final thing to talk about before talents, and that's pets. In Legion, each spec has its own designated pet. Destruction has the Imp, that deals 50% more damage to targets with Immolate, Fellhound is Affliction, and Felguard is Demonology. Pets are also unaffected by Mastery, and there isn't anything different with their abilities beyond the Voidwalker gaining a heal effect from each target that doesn't hold aggro. But I do have a concern about Imps. This is something that happens on Live that is still happening in Legion, and I've never seen a good reason for why it does. On other pets, the melee swing is reduced exactly by caster haste, and energy regen is increased slightly beyond that to make their instant casts occur faster. But Imps are weird. The cast time for their Firebolt appears to be reduced correctly from 2 seconds down to 1.6 with 25% haste, but the time between casts is 2.4 seconds, and without haste it's 4 seconds. So whilst the cast time is reduced and the energy rate is increased, the Imp is spending roughly 50% additional time waiting for energy, or 1/3 of its total cast time doing nothing. It's an exact 2/3, 1/3 split, so it looks intentional, but if you're trying to control the total amount of damage, I don't understand why you would delay casts instead of lowering damage. The most logical reason for delays would be to handle movement. If the Imp chain casts, any time it has to move, it loses DPS. But if this was their intention, its required amount of energy to cast would be significantly lower than what it is now, and then if a target moved out of range, it would have the buffer of recharging energy before it lost resources. But it's casting at nearly capped energy, and its energy does cap every few casts anyway. And waiting such a small time between casts, it automatically loses resources any time it has to move. One of the main reasons this doesn't make sense to me is because when you look at the only other pure casting pet, the Doomguard, its energy rate is many times faster than its cast time. Even under massive haste effects like Demonic Empowerment, it still chain casts. If you wanted to scale the damage differently for Imps, why not increase the damage or increase the cost and lower the required threshold to cast? That way it has several seconds between casts and most movement doesn't cap energy. The only positive you can take from the current system is that since each pet has a resource pool larger than their cooldowns, we can force cast abilities during periods where you want higher DPS, knowing that once the pet runs out of energy, you'll have a long period of time where it sits there doing nothing. But there is no difference in total damage, we've only redistributed it. And, as the other pets have instant cast abilities with no cooldowns, it is possible to rapidly force cast their entire energy pool. But taking any pet other than the Imp would be quite a large damage loss. And since pet damage is low in general, this is more of an exercise in fine-tuning than worth actively doing during gameplay. Right, sorry for the tangent, let's move on to talents. If you're expecting the action bar to miraculously fill from this point, it doesn't. Tier 15. Backdraft. Casting Conflagrate reduces the cast time of Incinerate and Chaos Bolt by 30% for 5 seconds. This covers roughly half its recharge time, and the 30% is taken from your current cast time, not the base. Because the duration is fixed, haste can get you an extra cast or two, but because Conflag is instant and has no travel time, it is triggered immediately, so you have to deduct the global cooldown from the uptime, losing anywhere from 1.5 to say 1.2 seconds at 25% haste. 25% was easy to find on gear, was why it keeps popping up. So really, you have a little over 3.5 seconds to play with, but no haste is unrealistic. So 25% with reverse entropy, this puts 2 Chaos Bolts in at 3.5 seconds, so you can get just a third cast off. If you wanted to spam Incinerate at 1.12 seconds, you can get 4 casts off. Roaring Blaze. Conflagrate increases your remaining Immolate damage on the target by 50% until Immolate expires or is refreshed. Works on the assumption that you chain cast Immolate and Conflag because Conflag will land before the first tick. This stacks, so you can put both charges into the same Immolate, and since the tick starts a long time after casting, it means you can put both charges into Immolate before the first tick. Worth noting that the cooldown of Conflag at 10ish seconds and the duration of Immolate at 15 seconds means you can put a third Conflag in for the last few ticks if you wanted to, but it seems to be 50% of the base, so that would be wasted damage off the next Immolate. There is no real benefit to stacking it up, since it's just a fixed amount of damage whatever you do with it. but you can comfortably maintain this permanently single target, and the effect is cleaved by Havoc. I have little interest in the PvP talents, but I do look at them, and I would like to draw your attention to two talents that I have tested, and they render this talent completely pointless in PvP. Cremation, Conflagrate consumes Immolate, and Incineration, Incinerate refreshes the duration of Immolate. Cremation doesn't deal the remaining damage of Immolate, it just removes it, and Incineration's refresh just switches this off. Usually I wouldn't be worried about this thing because it's alpha, but none of these talents are a surprise to developers. How did this get through? Shadow Burn, 1 shard instant. Blast the target for shadow damage, generates 2 shards if the target dies within 5 seconds. This no longer has a percentage health requirement, you are free to cast whenever. But with shards being so RNG now, consistent generation isn't to be overlooked. The damage per shard isn't really equatable to Chaos Bolt, because this doesn't always crit or benefit from crit increasing its damage. It's handy for leveling, but I don't think you'll be using this beyond occasionally sniping ads for shards. Interestingly, killing a Havoc target with Shadowburn does generate shards. Tier 30. Reverse Entropy. Reduces the cast time of Chaos Bolt and Rain of Fire by half a second, and they restore 35% of your maximum mana. The reduced cast time comes from the base, and the haste is applied after. It's the slower of the two options. The mana regen is very strong, and means you never have to use Life Tap, ever, giving you several global cooldowns back during a fight. Fire and Brimstone. Incinerate now hits all enemies near your target. This used to be the toggle in Warlords to switch on AoE, and whilst that could get a bit irritating at times when rapidly switching between modes, it was a unique part of the spec that I'm sorry to see pruned away. Now, this is just an always-on AoE effect. There is no reduction in damage, it simply casts Incinerate at everything. It's an odd design really, because usually specs have some easy access AoE and you talent in harder hitting spenders or variation. But for destruction, you only get the one AoE spender and have to talent in the spam, which means you're forced to take this talent for the vast majority of time outside of raids. And the main downside of that is because it turns Incinerate into a permanent AoE effect, it no longer contributes towards Soul Leech shields, meaning you only get Immolate ticks, Conflag, and the occasional Chaos Bolt. But considering you are using this for AoE questing, you'd be using Rain, so you don't even get the Chaos Bolts. Your pet is very fragile AoE tanking compared to the other specs, and dies very easily. Mana Tap. Consumes 40% of current mana to grant 10% increased damage for 20 seconds. Nothing particularly complicated about using this. It costs a global cooldown and 40% of your mana every 20 seconds, which simply means you lose more globals to Life Tap. It benefits from dot extension, so you only need to refresh under 6 seconds to not lose any time. However, the cost of maintaining 10% more damage over 1 minute is 3 globals for Mana Tap and 4 globals for Life Tap to make this mana neutral. So multiply 7 by your current global cooldown. As I'm testing with 25% haste, that would be 1.2 seconds, meaning 8.4 seconds lost, or 14% of every minute, or your total fight time. So 14% of a 7-minute fight is 1 minute of your time spent maintaining this buff. So whenever possible, I'm going to go with Reverse Entropy. 45. Demon Skin. Your Soul Leech absorption now passively recharges at a rate of 1% max health per second, and now absorbs 20% of max health. This is good. It absorbs everything, Life Tap, Burning Rush, all damage types. It is basically healing 1% of your max health every second whilst providing you with a floating buffer of 20%. Hopefully it survives, but it's very strong. The other two options are weaker and basically unchanged from Warlords. Mortal Coil is the same, and Shadow Fury is the same except that it now has a 1.5 second based cast time. I'm not particularly happy about it, but you're going to be using Demon Skin anyway. Tier 60. Eradication. Chaos Bolt increases damage you deal to the target by 12% for 6 seconds. This is the sustained DPS talent and is mirrored with Havoc. Clearly you try to maximise the uptime of the buff throughout the fight, but with shard generation being what it is, this won't have 100% uptime. Of course, with more crit or more targets, that uptime will naturally increase. Cataclysm, 3-second cast, 60-second cooldown. Conjures a Cataclysm at the target location, dealing Shadow Flame damage to all enemies within 8 yards and afflicting them with Immolate. The damage could have more punch for the length of the cooldown, and the shard generation from all the Immolate means you cap out for basically the whole time they're up. It's just unfortunate your only option is Rain of Fire, but let's not start that up again. Soul Harvest, 2-second cast, 2-minute cooldown. Immediately generates 5 shards. It's not very interesting, and the cooldown is really long for 5 shards. But the options in this tier aren't focused on how you generate shards, but the manner in which you deal damage. Eradication is clearly sustained or very minor variation because the 12% is fixed. Cataclysm is obviously AoE, and this is a burst cooldown. So assuming no procs from Immolate, the maximum number of Chaos Bolts starting from 5 shards is 3 with 1 Conflagrate. As all this does is reset you to 5 shards, the maximum number of Chaos Bolts you can get through with this and Conflagrate charges is 6. Considering the damage increases from Chaos Bolt, it's not insubstantial. Adding in Conduit and procs from Immolate, you can consider this to be a minimum of 6 bolts, rather than a maximum. Tier 75, Demonic Circle. This is the same spell as Warlords, except that it is now restricted as a talent, and they have merged both ends of the spell into one, where the button changes from Summon Circle into Portal. The only way to clear the portal in combat once you made it is with a cancel aura macro, so that's still 2 buttons. If this is staying a talent, at least make it functional. Burning Rush, same as Warlords, absorbed by Leech, so you don't kill yourself running from stuff, at least not immediately. Dark Pact. This is just Sacrificial Pact. Dark Bargain has been removed, and I still don't know why they named it this. 90. This is the Grimoire tier. Supremacy. Used to be the upgraded versions of pets, those have all gone, but the skins are available as a glyph. Basically, Servitude is the new Supremacy, so this gives permanent control over Doom Guards and Infernals. Service, pretty much the same as Warlords, summons a second demon for 25 seconds, that deals 100% additional damage, uses its ability on summon, and has a 90-second cooldown. Sacrifice has changed from Warlords. Sacrifice your demon to gain demonic power, causing your spells to sometimes also deal shadow damage to the target and other enemies within 8 yards. Lasts 1 hour. It doesn't trigger from rifts or from itself, and for some reason the sacrifice buff turns itself off every time you change any talents. However, the proc mechanics are a little odd to say the least, and have some quite major flaws. It could be that it's random, it does say sometimes in the description, but if it is, I am magically repeating the same effects at the same places again and again. For example, if you have 2 casts landing on the same target in quick succession, it only triggers once, and you lose the proc from the other. Whilst this internal cooldown is understandable, it has an implication on Conflagrate. It used to be that casting Conflagrate behind any ability would only trigger once. This has been partially fixed to work for spells with travel times, i.e. Incinerate and Chaos Bolt. At ranges longer than 12 yards from the target, you will get demonic power of both spells. But it means it's still about the travel time, so if you cast Immolate, then Conflagrate, you'll only get 1 trigger, which is awkward considering that's the oldest staple of destruction, but you shouldn't do that anymore if this stays as is. Conveniently, demonic power functions completely differently against target dummies than it does in the world. On dummies, it triggers on damage type per target, meaning direct damage casts like Incinerate trigger every time, but Immolate trigger once on application, then twice on dot, and then stop. In the world, in isolation, demonic power triggers off direct damage hits, and off of every Immolate tick, if that's the only thing happening to the target, because it seems to be suffering from several issues. Whilst it would be consistently ticking against Immolate, it can stop whilst you cast spells, or when multiple abilities hit, or just fail to trigger at all. Bizarrely, meaning that if you want the maximum amount of ticks on 2 targets, you only apply Immolate on 1 target and cast Incinerate against the other. If the timing works out, you trigger demonic power off every tick and every hit, which isn't really rational, but if the hits overlap, you stop demonic power triggering for seconds at a time, which is again not really rational. It also appears to be capped in time, not location, tested by havocing 2 targets with Immolate, then fearing one out of range and keeping the other one next to me. Only 1 tick of demonic power is registered against 2 ticks of Immolate. But that's another point. It's random which target triggers the effect. That wouldn't be an issue, except it has an AoE component. So you have a pack of adds, and one walks off. It appears it can pick the target standing by itself. Obviously, the percentage chance of it landing in the pack is higher because there are more targets there, but the possibility exists. The other issue with AoE is that because it has an 8-yard range, if it triggers from a target on the edge of a spread pack, it misses targets on the opposite side. This is a consistent and more visible issue when using Fire and Brimstone. It only triggers once per hit, I assume to prevent it from being exponential, but the damage is not split between targets. However, it also behaves strangely with the other AoE spells. Rain of Fire basically ignores the effect completely, and I have no consistent way of seeing what it is or isn't hitting. But it does occasionally trigger demonic power. But it's rain, what do you expect? Cataclysm can deliver a proc on cast if there are no other spells active to block it out, but the immolates it put up can sometimes be completely ignored and never trigger beyond the first tick, which is what they do on target dummies. Others will trigger every tick like normal, there is no in between, it's one or the other. But the AoE tests were mostly in isolation. Realistically, you're going to be combining Cataclysm and Rain of Fire with Fire and Brimstone. In that situation, it seems to consistently proc with either Immolate or Incinerate, completely ignoring Rain. But when adding and Conflagrate to the mix, that seems to prevent it triggering for up to 4 seconds. Overall, the idea isn't bad, but it's not that interesting, and the implementation is really weird. And if I'm only even slightly right about how it works, I just don't want to use it. Tier 100. Wreak Havoc. Havoc now lasts 20 seconds and has no cooldown. This is a genuinely great talent. I'm fairly certain this is now the only spec in the game that can mirror its entire single target rotation without reduction or repeating casts. So it would be within expectations to assume Destruction should be the strongest 2-target spec, and it would be terribly sad if it wasn't. That would mean its single target damage was basically irrelevant, which makes me think this will probably get walked back before launch, but hopefully it won't. Soul Conduit. Every shard you spend has a 20% chance to be refunded. This was recently nerfed down from 30%. It doesn't really have the same impact on gameplay as it does with demonology builds, because the rate you go through shards just isn't the same. Lastly, there is Channel Demon Fire, 15-second cooldown. Launches 15 bolts of Felfire over 3 seconds at random targets afflicted by your Immolate within 40 yards. I could spend several minutes talking about the mediocrity of this talent. In fact, I did and cut it out. So in short, this is completely pointless and very boring. Even if they made this ability massively overpowered, it would then arguably be less pointless, but would still be a very big missed opportunity. So many different things could be here instead. Different interactions with Havoc, for example. There don't even have to be new ideas to be better. You could bring back the effect of the old Fire and Brimstone and have casts cleaving when they hit a Havoc target, AoEing spells around them. Or take the PvP talent, Bane of Havoc, which is basically the same thing, but ground-based, and then tune that for PvE. If not Havoc, this would be a perfect place to save face. Move Rain of Fire here, and replace it with a direct damage AoE spell that doesn't even have to be Chaos Bolts. Rain much more easily fills the same role of Ravager from the Warrior Tree, whilst automatically being a better choice than Demon Fire. They wouldn't even need to fix any of the really wonky overwrite mechanics of Rain, because they could just give it a cooldown. Or on a completely different tack, they could address the narrow resource range, by either lowering the cost of Chaos Bolts or increasing the shard cap, like Anticipation in the Rogue talent tree. This would free players from the excessive constraints, whilst you would be sacrificing cleave damage or sustained DPS in order to redistribute your damage. But pretty much anything is better than this. Okay, that's talents. I don't think there's any reason to go through builds, they should seem fairly obvious. Are you doing AoE? Take AoE talents. As for stats, I can only look at the logic at this point. Crit provides additional shard generation from Immolate and Chaos Bolt damage. Haste provides faster conflag charges, more casts overall, and more ticks per Immolate for increased generation. And of course, Mastery is just an aspect for total despair. For gameplay and resources, you go Crit Haste, with some Mastery. Crit and Haste are about 0.3% per 100 rating for most classes. Could be all, but I haven't checked. It's worth noting that Destruction has a higher Mastery conversion of 0.86% per 100 rating compared to the average 0.57% per 100 of the others. But you have to consider that is totally random and you're still dealing with the average. It's also worth noting that these stats are different to demonology. You will need a whole new gear set to switch weapons. You could push towards mastery, but you spin the RNG wheel at the cost of sanity. At this point, I've covered pretty much everything but the weapon, which I'm afraid is just as disappointing as every other one. The only trait that has any impact on management is Dimension Ripper, where Incinerate has a chance to give a charge of Dimensional Rift. All this means is, you can't ever sit at 2 charges, you always need to sit at 1 or 0. I don't know if this has an internal cooldown, because Incinerate takes so long to arrive at the target, you will have casted the next one by the time the first one hits, and then both could give you a charge. So limit your risk of being fortuitously unlucky and proccing multiple times, so preferably sit at 0. There's only a few traits that seem worth adding relics to. Burning Hunger increases the crit chance of Immolate by 10% per rank. Every tick that crits is a 30% chance for a shard, and shard generation is crucial. However, there will undoubtedly be a breakpoint in the quantity of crit where taking the next option becomes better. That being Chaotic Instability, increases the crit damage of Chaos Bolt by 5% per rank. Crit has a fixed effect on Immolate, the tick either crits or it doesn't, but it scales continuously with Chaos Bolt, so once you have enough crit to adequately fund yourself, moving relics here makes sense. The last option is Soul Snatcher. Each rank gives a 5% chance for Chaos Bolt to refund a shard, but adds even more RNG. I'm currently unsure how this interacts with Conduit, whether it's a separate roll or a combined total will clearly impact its value, but this means you are choosing sustained, over-controlled damage. And with that we arrive at the conclusion. As you've probably guessed, in general I'm not overly thrilled by this new version of Destruction. On the surface it doesn't look like a great deal has changed, but the further simplification of an already simple design has left it feeling much too linear and consequently really quite dull, although I could attribute a lot of the blandness to poor shard generation in poor gear. I can see how they approach the changes to resources. Losing the decimal place meant that fixed generation would lead to a very fixed rotation, but RNG doesn't break up the gameplay. Once Immolate is up, you know full well that Incineration has no bearing on anything, and you are only doing busy work waiting for shards. The limited range on resources is a problem they caused for themselves by doubling the cost of Chaos Bolt. Yes, the damage per shard could be the same, so if anything, it could be a damage per cast increase, but the impact on gameplay means there's no resource management. You lose almost half your shards every time you cast Chaos Bolt. And to address the prevalence of RNG in the spec, is this supposed to add something? I mean, it doesn't. You can manage it as best you can on the way in, but you have no control over mastery on the way out. As long as you spend shards, there is very little to show any form of distinction between players beyond simple luck. Ultimately, there is still some time left before the not quite at the maximum deadline for launch date, so reason to live in hope. I think that comes to the end of another long review. I seem to be physically incapable of doing anything other than these marathons, regardless of my initial desires for brevity, but I will continue to strive towards shorter workloads. Not sure what I'm going to do as the next one, we'll just have to see what happens, but as ever, feel free to add any questions or comments. Thanks for watching!